Jennifer Bisceglie, the founder and CEO of Interos, the firm monitors global supply chains, is here to give us an update. Jennifer, nice to see you here.
Good to see you.
Let's talk a little bit about where we are. Clearly, the pandemic caused significant damage to global supply chains. Now we have the Russia-Ukraine situation to add on top of that. Nike sounded pretty positive last night on the call, but broadly, how would you characterize the situation?
I would characterize it as quick moving and still not quite understood. The interesting thing about Nike and their earnings is that they had to jump on it. If you think about it, they were called out on their supply chain last year. So they've had months to actually, and it was elevated. It was elevated to the CEO level and to the board level. And more than anything, supply chain and choices around the supply chain and investments are being made by the consumers. And Nike's a perfect example of that. So if you fast forward to what's happening with the Ukraine and what you were just talking about in the previous segment, you're still at the B2B level, so businesses dealing with businesses, and they weren't looking at this. They were not trying to understand not just who they were buying from, but who those suppliers were buying from. And looking at Ukraine and Russia, if we're literally cutting off whole parts of our developed economy, which is what the sanctions are doing, where else do I go for titanium and copper and nickel? There aren't any places to go quickly, and that's what you're seeing happen right now.
Jennifer, I'm curious about the extra pressure that's coming from the war here. When you do start to see just the amount of exports that Russia has really created dependence upon when it comes to the rest of the world, do you start to see on the back of these new sanctions, on the back of this war, some of these new trade routes, these new supply chains kind of being redrawn around the world?
Well, I think to the point that was mentioned a minute ago, I think the last 24 months have just created, if nothing else, a wake-up call and the opportunity to get educated. Every company, every country in the world realized how simply hyper-connected they are and how reliant they are in the extended supply chain to countries and companies around the world that they simply had no idea. And so I think you've seen shifts in the supply chain over the last 24 months that are going to continue. There's sometimes that a global supply chain is not a good thing, and you're seeing that right now. Sometimes you really need a localized or a hyper-localized supply chain. You're seeing that in agriculture. This is not going away. And again, it's become a CEO problem and a board problem, and it's being played out in the court of public opinion.
How quickly does the situation stabilize?
Yeah. It's the magic question, and I don't know that it ever does, because, again, we've been proven that so much of what's happening in the supply chain is outside of your control. Where Nike won is they invested in technology, they had a cultural leadership shift, and they engaged with their suppliers. That is going to be an ongoing, never-ending situation for the time to come.
Okay.
Give us a little bit of a timeline here, a sneak peek into the future, if you will. How long does these supply chain issues really last? When can we expect some relief, and when can we expect perhaps a new normal?
Well, I think which supply chain? So if you think again about the last 2 years, you had the pandemic that happened 2 years ago, and then you just had 17.5 million people that were told to stay home in China last week that did it again. You had the ship that went sideways in the canal. You had multiple examples of cyber breaches with SolarWinds and Kaseya. These hits just keep on coming, so I don't know that anything ever finishes. I do think that what will change is that there are going to be technology investments in truly getting the transparency and the trust into the supply chain, and this conversation will be ongoing. That's what's going to happen, and it's happening today, and I fully expect 2022 into 23, you're going to see major investments in technology that make this better, because, again, the consumers are making those decisions with their wallets and with their feet.
Okay, but let's just talk about it from a B2B point of view still, though, for now. How much is this going to cost to get supply chains to work again? How inflationary are we going to see? Is the situation going to be? Because that's what we're all trying to figure out right now. Stuff is going up. The consumer is definitely watching this happen. The consumer is watching just about everything that he or she buys go up quite aggressively right now. And supply chains are being largely blamed for that. So the consumer is understanding that this is happening. How quickly can companies start to make the changes that you're talking about to start and bring those prices down? Or is this going to be a continuously elevated inflationary story? Prices are just going to continue to go up because supply chains are broken. They're going to take a long time to heal. And as a result of which, this is going to be not a kind of multi-month story, but a multi-year story.
Yeah, I don't think it's an end of the world situation.
Right.
I do think that when you talk about what's going to fix the supply chain, there are multiple supply chains. Even though there's overlap in industries like aerospace and defense and oil oil and gas have very similar supply chains, but there has to be the investment. So to answer your question, there is technology that exists today to provide the transparency in the supply chain that companies need to make it better. I would argue that some of the challenge with inflation is simple uncertainty because companies were lazy. We had very fragile and short supply chains that were built in the 90s all around this just in time. Yeah. And now you're seeing that really rethought, and you're seeing the investment and the technology that's creating agility in the supply chain. That's what costs. It's the cultural shift and the advance of technology. But is this going to be never ending? It is.
So just to jump in.
Yeah.
A company's running with significantly higher levels of working capital right now because their supply chains are broken, so they're carrying more inventory in order to make sure that their businesses can carry on. Is that something that ultimately you see fading off? I.e., do we see a destocking in certain areas because companies are basically hoarding at the moment? Or is it simply that they can't get hold of what they need? I'm just kind of wondering what you see happening within businesses.
I think it depends on the industry. So if you look at what's happening in the automotive, they're doing more about, they're going to build a car based on your request. So it's more of a just-in-time, made-to-order. So that'll smooth out some of the hoarding of inventory that you're seeing. There are certain other industries like retail where you might see them stockpile more to make sure that whenever any of us as consumers go to the store, we always have what we need at a moment's notice. So I think it depends on industry. Not every industry is made for hoarding. I think you're seeing it now, again, because that transparency and trust in the supply chain doesn't exist because, unfortunately, we got caught a little flat-footed when the sanctions and the crisis broke out.
Jennifer, we were just talking to Javier Blas in our last segment simply about the impact of tariffs on steel, for example. There are still tariffs in play between the United States and China. They've never really went away. They just went away from the spotlight. Can you speak a little bit about the tariff impact and the trade impact that might be playing into the supply chain dynamic?
Well, I think kind of all bets are off as far as who we were wanting to do business with, simply because, again, the sanctions in Russia are cutting off whole parts of the global economy in a way that we weren't ready for. And so if you look at what happened with Shell a couple weeks ago, they went public to say we have to continue to buy oil from Russia. We apologize for that, but we don't have the ability to make the change, and we're going to donate our profits. So I think if you think about trade and tariffs, some of the things that we might have called rules and some of the hard and fast decisions about where we did and didn't want to do business and who we wanted to do business with may shift a little bit as we're trying to figure this stuff out. If you think about what's happening here in Europe, we're actually taking a step back from a fuel standpoint because they need to unhook from the reserves in China before they move forward and move into clean energy again. So I think a lot of those things are some of the tools that we can use to get out of some of the inflation and build the trust back into the supply chain and the global economy that we really need. Businesses simply cannot keep operating with this reactionary and whack-a-mole approach to figuring out the supply chain.
Do you think we're going to see more vertical integration as a result of this?
I do. I think you're going to see a lot of mergers and acquisition. And again, if you look at what's happening in chips, you see that that's happening from an automotive standpoint. And you are seeing folks that are either starting to manufacture their own, and then they'll spin those companies off later maybe, but it is natural tendency to try to control more of it. And you'll also see just a natural consolidation of some markets. I also think that still might be a point in time because it's a cultural shift, and as the technology advances, and I can actually see transparency in my supply chain and trust it, then there's lots of opportunity, innovation, price competitiveness by having a larger supply chain.
Jennifer, great to see you. Thanks for stopping by. Really appreciate the time. Jennifer Bisceglie, Interos CEO and founder. This is Bloomberg.